which I didn't start sitting, but ended up taking. And what I learned in that degree changed my life. It opened my eyes to the appalling, quite frankly, impact that humans have on Earth's geophysical cycles, like water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the most important for climate change, the carbon dioxide cycle. I have some slides for you. I'm going to see if I can get them to you. I'm going to share and try this. And share. Aha. Can you see a presentation? Yes, you can. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. It's not playing with me. Ah, there we go. We're now doing it backwards. The way that I'm going to go through this presentation is I've only got 7 slides for you. I'm going to look at what is COP, how does it work, what is COP26 all about, the significance of the number, and finally the UK progress towards its climate change targets, which are going to be examined at COP this year. So first of all, what is COP? In 1992, the United Nations hosted what has become known as the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. At that conference, it established the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You'll see it abbreviated as UNFCCC. After it agreed that so far as the atmosphere was concerned, there is a problem. I always want to finish that off by saying Houston, but I'm sure they know. Ever since 1995, the Framework Convention has held a conference, which you'll see called the Global Conference, Climate Change Conference, etc. It's a conference of parties, and that is what COP stands for, Conference of Parties. So who are the parties? The parties are the sovereign states around the world on Earth that have signed up to the aims and ambitions and objectives of the Climate Change Conference targets and objectives. 197 sovereign states around the world have signed. So I know what you're all thinking. Who are the other 2 and why haven't they signed? One of them is the Vatican. The Vatican doesn't sign up to any of the objectives of the United Nations, but it is an observer. And indeed, very recently, I've certainly seen news presentations about what the Pope has said about tackling climate change around the world. The other party is Palestine. And I think I'm going to send you off to Israel or the United States to see if you can work out why they haven't been allowed to sign up to any of the United Nations conference objectives and aims. End of political speech. COP26 is in Glasgow this year from the 1st to the 12th of November. We've already had some preliminary and fringe meetings that have taken place in Italy and Switzerland. This is the very first time ever that COP has come to the UK. Glasgow will be, I think, invaded by somewhere in the region of 30,000 attendees and many more organisations and groups that are literally walking there as we speak in order to make their views known about what the aims and objectives and the past performance in particular of the targets that have been set by the United Nations COPs in the past. The president of COP26 is Alok Sharma, who is an MP, UK MP for West Reading. So how does it work? COP has two roles. Its first role is to review progress of each party's nationally determined contributions. You will see them and hear them referred to as NDCs. The NDCs are the actions that are taken by each country to help it to achieve the climate change targets that have been agreed at previous COPs. The United Nations analyses the potential impact of all NDCs on the overall target to be achieved, and it's hoped that over time, the global sum of NDCs achieves at least 100% of the targets agreed. So between COPs, United Nations monitors their progress, and if it finds that progress towards the party's NDCs is not being achieved, the United Nations asks it to improve its NDCs immediately to get back on track. The United Nations then reports its findings about every party's NDCs to the next COP, which is what will happen at COP26, about which there will be lots of discussion and debate and argument and negotiations, etc. The second role of COP is to negotiate any new climate change targets, things that have been discussed over the last 5 years. The negotiations use things like game theory and negotiating techniques in order for countries to agree some of the aims and objectives about achieving a change in our climate. They also take into account things that have happened since the last previous COP, things like geopolitical changes and other changes that we've had that might affect future targets of for climate change objectives. Things like COVID-19 is going to wax large at this next COP. Any wars around the world, changes in leadership, particularly if they are changes in political directions, etc. And I should imagine that Afghanistan will be mentioned many times at COP as well. There have been some very famous climate change targets in the past. In 1997, you might be aware that we passed an agreement, we agreed to lots of targets, etc., called the Kyoto Agreement. That was the very first COP, United Nations COP, when it was acknowledged and accepted that in order to tackle climate change, we have to reduce carbon dioxide emissions around the world. An earlier one, which was actually done before the COPs were set up, but has now come within the remit of COP monitoring, is the Montreal Protocol, which looked at the hole in the ozone layer, which at that time was getting bigger, and what needed to be done in order to help close it. And you might be aware that one of the things they agreed was that they agreed to ban chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, around the world because that was being identified as the main contributor to the ozone layer opening up. COP26 focus this year, its focus is to go back and have a look at the Paris Agreement, which was at COP21 2015, to see what progress has been made. I'm going to attempt to launch a little video for you. It's only 1 minute and 40 seconds. We'll see if I can launch this.
What is the Paris Agreement?
Can you see that?
The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change.
You can't see that.
Global warming to well below 2.
I wasn't sure that was going to launch properly, so I will abandon that and come back to you. Can you see my presentation again? Thank you. Okay, so basically the Paris Agreement was when it was agreed around the world that what we need to do is to limit the average global surface air temperature rise. From now on, I'm just going to call that increases in temperature or worse to that effect, to not more than 1.5 degrees centigrade over the temperature, the average temperature around the world as at 1800, the year 1800, and to do that by 2050. I'll come back and repeat some of those figures in a slightly different context as I go through. So there are two types of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, that were agreed at the Paris Agreement to try and achieve that target. The first one is that every country has to reduce domestic greenhouse gas emissions and help LDCs do the same. Hold on to LDCs until I get to the end of this slide. The second area of nationally determined contributions is that each country must build domestic resilience to respond to the impacts of extreme weather and to help LDCs do the same. So what we're looking at there is what is the UK and other countries around the world going to do to help us live through heat waves, floods, coastal erosion, etc., but also to help LDCs do the same. So what is an LDC? An LDC is a least developed country, and they've been identified and named by the United Nations. And the point of helping them to do the same as every other country is because we do want them to develop economically, but we don't want them to do that by going down the same fossil fuel route that developed countries used, which has resulted in current atmospheric conditions that are triggering climate change. The help that LDCs need is not simply financial, but they also need the knowledge and physical skills to help the renewable technology required, to help them to develop the renewable technology required, to enable them to sidestep or leapfrog the fossil fuel route to energy creation. So let's have a look first of all at the UK progress towards its own NDCs. Unfortunately, the UK is not on target to achieve its own nationally determined contributions. The Climate Change Act was passed in 2008. It was amended in 2019. It legalises its #1 NDC, and its #1 NDC is to achieve what is called net zero by 2050. Net zero means that they have to have policies in place to make sure that by 2050, if a policy creates carbon emissions, other policies reduce the same volume of carbon emissions back down to zero. In 2021, this year, an all-party parliamentary climate change group was established in the House of Commons. Daisy Cooper, who is the MP for St Albans, is one of the vice chairs of that committee. There are 11 vice chairs around the country. What that climate change group has done is commissioned an organisation, an independent research consultancy called Policy Connect, and asked it to monitor the UK government's policies to achieve its #1 NDC. Policy Connect does not yet, it will do in future, but it doesn't yet monitor the outcomes of those policies, how successful they've been, what the performance of those policies has been. All that is being asked of Policy Connect at the moment is to see what policies we have and to decide whether or not it looks as if when they're all in place, when they're all in action, will we actually achieve that net zero by 2050 NDC. They've created something called a policy dashboard, climate policy dashboard. As I've said already, the UK is not on target yet to achieve its legal obligation, because it's in an act, of achieving net zero by 2050. And the APPCCG, the All-Party Parliamentary Climate Change Committee, has said that if the UK wants to be seen as a climate change leader around the world, it needs to provide evidence that it has and can reduce domestic greenhouse gases, its #1 NDC, and improve its resilience support, not only to itself, but also to LDCs as well. So what you have on this slide is a table. They've broken down the different sectors, different industry sectors in the UK into six categories. We have power, transport, agriculture, manufacturing, building, which is one of my pet projects, and waste. And you can see there that they have looked at the policies that are currently in place, not the performance against them, but the policies, and mark them out of 10 as to how far they think they are going to be able to achieve the net zero promise by 2050. Power, 6 out of 10. Around the world, that's a pretty good score. The UK does have a reputation for very high renewables technology development, particularly using wind. Except today, I don't think the wind is blowing at all. And also hydro, particularly in Scotland. But they've been criticised by not just Policy Connect, but also the Climate Change Committee for not being able to harness more solar energy and also tidal and wave energy, given that we are a fairly small island and completely surrounded by a tide that we can predict for several thousand years into the future. We're not yet harnessing the energy that that creates. Look at the bottom one. We've been dubbed critically insufficient in terms of our waste sector policy development, 2 out of 10. We do have some fairly ad hoc and local laws, what do they call, bylaws around the country, but there's very little enforcement of them. Countries and companies are not yet being fined for the way that they deal with the waste that comes along with the products and services that they provide. We don't have a national scheme of domestic waste disposal. We recently moved about 18 months ago, and we've had to learn a whole new list of colours of bins from where we came from as to what we can put into each bin. And in this country, although there's a great deal of plastic collection and plastic items going into buckets that talk about recycling, we're still not doing very recycling of that plastic, and we're certainly not disposing of that plastic that we don't recycle. We used to offshore it and send it to the Philippines and to Bangladesh, etc., who have now said, we don't want your plastic waste anymore. And so far, the government have not come up with ways to dispose of it here in the UK effectively enough. So there you've got transport and agriculture on 5 out of 10, and a little bit of information about what the policy dashboard have said they're good and not so good at. Manufacturing 4 out of 10, and building 3 out of 10. And I think I'm not going to say any more about building policies, otherwise I think I'd be here for the next hour and a half. This is a fairly damning critique of the UK performance, but let's put that into a world context. How is the world doing towards the Paris Agreement? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that the world is similarly not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement. In 2015, when the Paris Agreement was made, the global NDCs submitted to achieve the Paris Agreement were mathematically sufficient to stop that temperature rise above 1.5 degrees centigrade. But the world has not achieved them by 2021. It hasn't achieved it, and if it doesn't, as things stand at the moment, the United Nations predicts that in 2050, the temperature rise will be 2.9 degrees centigrade, which is almost double the target that was set at the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees. If the video had played, it would have mentioned that the Paris Agreement goals are going to be checked every 5 years. They're going to be reviewed, and they will be the focus of that next 5th yearly COP. But as a result of the NDC monitoring in 2021, the United Nations has stated that it's going to report the predicted temperature rise for 2050 every year from now on, not just every 5 years, to keep all parties focused on the Paris Agreement targets. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope that that very short presentation will help you put COP26 into a much wider context when it comes round on your television screens at the beginning of November.